Hey lovelies, Lisa here, wanting to do a quick follow-up video to my last video, which was an unboxing of this bad boy, the latest Rider-Waite-Smith deck coming from US Games, in which they returned to their original practice of publishing the deck with Pamela Coleman Smith's original hand-drawn titles on the bottom. One thing I didn't notice last time, but I've noticed since, is that the copyright, you probably can't read that, but the copyright on this new deck, which I just got, now reads copyright 1971-2019 US Games. So they've copyrighted now this return to the original design, which they changed sometime, I think, in the 90s. This is an A.G. Mueller version of the deck where they use the mechanical font, which allows them then to, produce this deck in Spanish and French and German and all these different languages and have the font be the same across the different decks. They didn't reissue a new copyright when they made that change, but now they are doing so with this return. Copyright. Copyright is nutty. Copyright for these images has been really complicated. That's the topic for a whole other video, but let me just say that in a published interview, Stuart Kaplan himself has said that in his eyes the copyright holds based on Pamela Coleman Smith's artwork. 70 years after her death, he feels that the artwork goes back into the public domain, which would be 2021 because she died in 1951. So there is a question in my mind about what happens next year, and I wonder if US Games is kind of positioning themselves to have staked a new copyright claim to this image based on their own reissuing of it. Oh, I don't know. People get really grumpy with US Games for this copyright issue, but the reality is, without Stuart Kaplan, we would not have a tarot renaissance. We would not have the thousands upon thousands of new decks that have appeared in the last decade or two. We would not have a YouTube community around tarot. So that man has single-handedly done more for the promotion and longevity of this beautiful mandala, these 78 cards, than any other person, including Pamela Coleman Smith, including Arthur Edward Waite, Aleister Crowley, any of the Eliphas Levi, anyone you want to name in the history of modern tarot. Stuart Kaplan, man. So I don't feel grumpy in my heart about the copyright issue, but I do feel confused and a little consternated that it remains such a confusing issue. At any rate, be that as it may. A couple of folks made comments to my last video that made me want to do this follow-up. One of those comments was Kelly Bear talking about her favorite version of this canonical tarot deck, the Waite-Smith deck, being the Centennial edition of the deck that came out from US Games in 2009, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the publication in 1909 of the deck. In US Games discussion of it, they say, okay, in this deck we return to the original colors chosen by Pamela Coleman Smith herself, these more muted colors. I don't know that I'm surprised that they make that claim. I'm not sure that we know what the original colors were that she intended. And I'd like to know more, but this deck does have this kind of vintage feel to it, right? The white backdrop is not truly white. The backgrounds of images, if you compare this hermit to the hermit in the latest US Games copy of the deck, you'll see what I mean. There's this sort of vintage aging feel as opposed to that sort of more flat color block feel, more sort of illustrators feel in, the more sort of traditional versions of the deck, yellow box and blue box versions of the deck. It's a lovely, I love this version of the deck. I love the cardstock, which is US Games cardstock at its finest, hefty and meaty, slight sheen to it, just sort of that silken feel, It feels wonderful to the touch, and the coloration is this muted version of all of the colors. They're all sort of made warmer and more sepia toned. Beautiful. But to my eyes, the deck in its most canonical iconographic form is the deck as it emerged in the late 60s, early 1970s. The deck as it was developed by, I'm looking for my copy, as it was developed by Ryder and Company, the blue box or the early yellow box decks, which also have muted colors but not that kind of sepia toned aged feel. If you look at, I've never held a PAM A, PAM B, PAM C, any of the like decks from the 20s, 30s, 40s in my hands, any of those early Ryder decks. But if you look at their images online, this 1970s copy of the deck seems most faithful to the deck as it was published, the real Rider-Waite-Smith deck, the canonical deck. So much as I love the Centennial, in my search for a kind of the canonical, paradigmatic Rider-Waite-Smith deck, it's the 1970s blue box or yellow box deck without the copyright on the side, with this very sharp image, with the calligraphy, with these soft yellows and blues. Yeah, this is it. This is it, folks. This is it. Okay. So I wanted to say that about why I didn't use the Centennial, because I love the Centennial. I particularly love the borderless version of the Centennial, even though it kind of expands out Pixie's imagery in a way. The other thing I wanted to talk about, someone asked about the University Books version of the deck. So, there's Ryder and Company, and then they stopped publishing the deck for a bunch of years. I don't know how many decades until they started again, I think, in the late 60s. Feel free to correct me below. These are elements of the history that are known, but I just don't have them fresh in my mind. And in that time, University Books, New York Hyde Park, right? University Books produced, starting in the 50s, a version of the deck. They were the first, they invented the whole concept of the little white book. They invented the concept of this tuck box, right? All of these things that we think about as compellingly a part of the modern Waite-Smith tarot deck come from University Books. And so someone was saying, how is that version of the deck similar or different from this new hand-drawn titles version from US Games? So there's really almost no comparison. In terms of a deck that one wants to own and play with, the pink ankh-backed version of the University Books deck, which also later, mine is probably like a much later 70s version of it from Carroll Publishing, maybe even as late as the early 80s. So this isn't one of the 1950s or 60s version, but as far as I can tell, the coloration and cardstock remain the same. The University Books or Carroll Publishing version, the pink ankh-back version of the deck, the cardstock is, it's light, very light, and the image quality the clarity of the images is not good. There are no copyrights, but the printing, if you can see like in the Magician, it's just messy, right? The coloring and the printing. Look at the High Priestess. For historical reasons, this deck is important, but in terms of clarity and then also in terms of color, this deck is, this is not a deck that I wanted because it's such a wonderful version of the deck. It's a deck that I wanted for historical reasons. Again, this is the latest 2019 copyright, hot off the presses version of the Waite-Smith deck with copyright, but with the original titles. This is that sort of University Books version of the deck. My copy of it is probably from the 70s. So the colors are bright in both, but even though subtlety is lost in the modern Weightsmith from US Games, it's much higher than it is in the University Books version. So there's similarities, but yeah, check it out. With the levers, there's really no comparison. The University Books is very, very clumsy in its printing and very bright in its colors. Now, I kind of love it in a card like the Lovers. It reminds me of the Albano Weight, but mostly I don't think it's very successful. But there's similarities. I'm just going to go through a few more of these. You know, mostly it's like the cardstock is not good. The clarity is not good. Sorry, the Hanged Man. And I can't really, you know, the University Books is definitely more saturated, more tilting toward the sort of purple side of the register. But, you know, where you have, where you have sort of more cross-hatching and shading in the US Games version, in the University Books version, that gets kind of flattened out. Yeah. You know, there's something to be said for the coloring in the University Books version and some of these cards. You know, it's the more purple, adds some oomph. The angels definitely look a little bit more psychedelic. You know, they're Albano Weight type angels. So that's a thing. But yeah, but then, you know, you look at the way that image quality gets lost. So you completely lose the halo effect around the hand in the Ace of Swords. So all this just to say that the University Books version of this deck, it's similar to what we see now in terms of brighter colors than the 1970s yellow box or blue box, but cardstock is really thin and the coloring and the quality is just not as finely done. But, you know, without the University Books version of this deck, I mean, there would, you know, Weightsmith Tarot would have been lost because Ryder and Company was not publishing it during that period. Okay, I think that's all I want to share for now. I sort of had a mind to open this version of the deck, which comes from the 90s, I think, and just to compare it in terms of cardstock. So this is a Belgian version of the deck. So let me, maybe I'll keep it sealed. I'll keep it sealed. If people really want to know what this cardstock is like, maybe I'll open it in a future video. I'm trying to figure out, like, the moment when US Games starts getting rid of the original titles, but are still publishing the deck through A.G. Mueller and using Cartamundi cardstock and publishing techniques. What's the quality of the deck like then? And why can't we leave Italian printing behind, since it's not really so yummy? US Games Italian decks, yeah. Better than University Books, but not so much better. Okay, that's all I got for now. Hope this video, sort of rambly follow-up, was useful, helpful, interesting. Eager for your thoughts below, and as always, thank you for your practice.